listening to Stories from Real Life, a podcast by engaging storytellers for engaged story listeners. Here's your host, author and journalist, Melvin E. Edwards.
And fortifying our own defenses and being knowledgeable Americans.
So, have you personally gotten any love letters from Kim Jong-un?
Checked the box this morning, and nothing came in yet. So we're still waiting. We're still waiting. But I'm glad that you asked that question because I have a present for you. I'm going to show you. Not right now, but I'm going to commit to this present. I wanted to write an article theorizing what it might be like for Kim Jong-un to start this flattery campaign again. Let me just backtrack and say it's common knowledge here in Seoul, in Pyongyang, in Tokyo, in Taipei, in Beijing, anywhere, that Donald Trump was completely flipped by Kim Jong-un with nothing essentially in return to the United States or our allies, and that we're heading down that road again with him. So what I have drafted out is a draft letter from the foreign ministry by young underlings submitted to Kim Jong-un to flatter Trump and butter him up again as a kind of a joke. But I'm thinking, wait a second, I'm doing the foreign ministry's work for them. So I don't know. I think I'll release it. It's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek humor approach. But the point I'm trying to make is that Donald Trump was arrested for taking those love letters, which were some of his most prized possessions, when everybody in the real world knows it's just flattery and apple polishing, and they use the word excellency, which is common in diplomatic letters. And Trump apparently took it as some kind of, wow, he only speaks to me, which appeals to a malignant narcissist. Well, we all going along for the ride in the back of this car. So at any rate, make a long story short, stay tuned for that letter from Kim Jong-un to Donald Trump, and I'm going to provide it to you. Maybe you can deploy it in some fashion as you wish for your audience.
Wow, that we maybe have worldwide breaking news once that's released. That'll be. Hello again, and welcome to this December 10th edition of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thanks for joining me on this week's storytelling journey. Our guest this week is Thomas P. Logan. Good morning, Tom, and welcome to this week's podcast.
Greetings to you from Japan.
So, what time is it there in Japan where you are?
We are 30 minutes into the day. It's 30 minutes after midnight here.
Wow. So you're in the middle of the night. I appreciate you making time for us.
Not at all. I've been known. Yeah, I've been known in my career to be up at late hours sometimes talking to the U.S. So.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you're so accommodating because normally I would be dead asleep at that time of the night here. So I first want to start talking about politics and policy, and then I'll ask you some personal questions and to get your insights as an American living in Japan. So I learned yesterday that my podcast has been heard in 28 different countries, and we're worldwide today. So this is keeping with that. So you're an independent international cross-border consultant. That sounds really impressive. What is that?
Well, what I try to do is, and I've got my fingers in a couple of pies here internationally. I've been in Asia, and we'll get into my background, I guess, a little bit in this podcast. But I've been in Asia for, quite a number of years, a total time in Japan of about 31 years. And I've worked primarily for American industry here, high-tech industry, architectural industry, engineering, construction, and the like. And the challenge that I've always been working on in whether it's marketing or sales, business development, general management, is getting American firms into very challenging markets. And Japan is one of the most challenging markets in the world, as you may well know. A lot of language barriers, cultural barriers, legal barriers, you name it. It's always been a very difficult proposition for American or other foreign firms to get in here. So based on the many years of working for these firms, as a direct employee for them here in Tokyo and Osaka and other parts of Asia. Now I'm taking that experience to help individuals one by one penetrate the market looking for local staff, identifying key people who can maybe run their operations, doing individualized study on markets to see the viability of their products and services, seeing if there are trade barriers that may prevent them from getting in the market and how we can address those trade barriers by perhaps talking with the government of Japan and so on and so forth. So it is a process of advising these people that are coming into Japan. And there's also other areas that I do to try to explain Japan to the world, such as on LinkedIn. I occasionally sit down with a Japanese newspaper, just open it up to the front page, and I have the camera on it on the front page, and I take about 4 or 5 minutes explaining the headlines, what the key issues are that are here in Asia. Maybe I even throw in a little bit of Japanese language study for the people to get out of that. So I'm kind of situated between the U.S. and Japan and other nations in Japan as a bridge and as a go-between to help firms get in here.
Wow, that's really interesting. So the word tariff has been in the news a lot here in the United States, and I'm sure it sort of made its way across the ocean. So dealing with mostly with China, but would any new tariffs on Japanese exports impact your job directly?
I would say, not in the immediate future. I would say it would take a while for the effects to kick in. It could have a positive and a negative aspect to it. It could be negative in the sense of, well, this is going to obviously affect Japanese products coming to the United States to the consumers. So I'm not really representing Japanese firms so much in their efforts to get into the market or to deploy there that much. So in that sense, it doesn't. Where it does kind of affect us is just exacerbations and tit for tat and escalation on both sides. Because you, in dealing with Japan or many of other friends and adversaries, as you know, around the globe, you do something and it's going to engender some kind of response. So now that the president-elect has stated that he's going to put tariffs, and if I'm not mistaken on this, he only mentioned China, Mexico, and Canada. So he didn't say Japan yet, but they're like, okay, so what's going to happen to us? And they will find ways to maybe slow down American permits, for example. They may have a way to logjam the system for pharmaceutical approval for American firms in Japan. There's any number of things that they have that they can retaliate. And this is the trade war we'll talk about, a retaliatory spiral that we could enter into. In that respect, yeah, that would be bad for my personal business. And to be honest with you, it'd be bad for Japan, it'd be bad for American consumers, it'd be bad for world order and trading system, and no one's going to win a trade war, I don't think.
Wow. So we recently had an election here in the United States, and Donald Trump was reelected after being out of office for one term. So how is the incoming president viewed in the continent of Asia from what you've seen?
So what I'll do is maybe take several of the countries, because we have so many of them out here. Let's take the key ones: Japan, where I am; Korea, which I visited about 55 times now over the last 40 years, next to us. Let's take China and maybe Taiwan. We'll take those. Starting in Japan, Japan has traditionally supported, although they are obviously neutral, they've been more receptive for many years for Republican administrations. They've been a little less, enthusiastic towards, let's say, Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, because of, again, trade issues. The Democrats have tended to have kind of a stronger hardline trade position on enacting Section 301 of the trade law and retaliation of whatever. But this is really the first instance that I've ever seen of them, and they can't say it publicly, preferring the Democrat nominee over the Republican, primarily on the trade issue and also support for the U.S. Japan alliance. They've been, and I also should say, I should caveat my comments and say, I can't speak for all Americans in Japan. I can't speak for the entire Japanese government. You could probably have somebody just as seasoned and long time in Japan as me sit in the room with me and maybe offer a different perspective. So, but I think I'm calling it as I see it. And I would say from a popular perspective, public opinion polls were taken that showed fully 71% of the Japanese people did not support Donald Trump for president. It's an amazing number. And there was quite a positive image of Kamala Harris in the popular press at the grassroots level. Within the Japanese government, obviously, they take a neutral position and they're going to put a brave face on whoever they get. But if you get them aside and you're talking, off record and you back channel with Japanese people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or in media and retired diplomats and people from all walks of professional life, they're very, very nervous about Donald Trump. Kind of a loose cannon on the deck, the tariffs issue, the diplomatic relations with North Korea without consulting Japan. So that deals pretty much with Japan, I think. Korea is also a similar situation. You have an opposition now not in control in Korea that was more of a sunshine policy, they called it, an appeasing policy of outreaching to Kim Jong-un and trusting him on a lot of things and creating good relations, but also giving up a lot of their sovereignty to him, in my estimate. They're out now, and a more conservative pro-American government is in place. And they've been much more realistic about Kim Jong-un. They have worked with the U.S. to restart drills and training that was suspended under Donald Trump. The Korean government itself, I think, would be also very nervous. And again, being in diplomatic position, and they don't want to upset him. They know how transactional Trump is. They know how he can really not like you and then you'll have problems with him unless you manage your relationship with him. But overall, the Korean people are about 70% opposed to Donald Trump. So it's a very similar public opinion level that with the Japanese. And I would say the government itself was probably looking more towards a continuation of the Biden cooperation, and that is solidly with Japan, South Korea, and the U.S. in this Camp David Accord that came out last summer that really tied all three nations together strategically to counter the threats out here. In Taiwan, obviously, they're extremely nervous. The thing that really set them off was comments by Donald Trump, such as if the Europeans don't pay their fair share of NATO or the defense costs, well, then I'll just tell Vladimir Putin, you can go in and do whatever you want. And they also interpreted the same kind of discussion with Xi Jinping and did not see a strong backup of Taiwan if the worst scenario comes about. So I don't have the public opinion polls on that, but if Japan and Korea are any measure, they are probably also strongly supported Harris, I think. And then, of course, we come to China. And China, I think, is the big problem in the neighborhood here. They don't have an official position of one candidate over another. I think they probably were neutral on it. I think they could have lived with either candidate. They have been very careful not to make their official positions regarding Donald Trump, whether they like him or not, that strong. And there have been no public opinion polls that I know of in China. So that covers all four of those.
That's really fascinating. So, spreading out to different part of the world. Most Americans are aware of the situation between Ukraine and Russia right now, but not as many seem to have noticed that North Korea has gotten involved. How do you think the recent U.S. election will impact that entire situation?
The problem with North Korea, it is one of the most enigmatic, difficult to understand, opaque nations on the planet. We have a very scarce resources to really understand what's going in their decision making and what their next move is going to be. We monitor them along with Japan and South Korea and have a pretty good handle on a lot of things that they do. They basically want to keep their nuclear weapons program. They want to expand it. They also are intent upon working diagnostically with their intermediate and intermediate range launches to tweak their systems to evade Western technology, such as the THAAD system, to bring their missiles down. They want to work on multiple reentry vehicles, MIRVs, for ICBMs to hit the United States through all areas of the United States. This is technology. That will not change. They view it as their existence. So there was this Donald Salesman. That's a good slip of the tongue there. Donald Trump
Freudian
just sort of came on the scene, and flew into Singapore and sat down with the guy and said, "Come take a look at the beast. Let's go for a spin." And then in Hanoi, "Do you need a lift back to Pyongyang? You can ride in Air Force One." All these things that freaked out his security personnel, and not to mention his national security advisors and whatnot, things that were never done. Some people are saying, "Well, that's really cool." No, these are all national security implications of dangerous naivety towards Kim Jong-un, thinking he's his friend. So, and hopefully we can get more into North Korea, which is really one of the ones I've been spending a lot of time following. Regarding the impact of the elections, number one, the North Korean people will not even know of it. They got some news of George Bush, Jr. being elected. It's kind of showed up in a snippet of a newspaper. Otherwise, they're not really told about American leaders. If Trump goes to, let's say, North Korea to sign a peace treaty to end the Korean War with nothing in return, that'll be big news. It'll be all over. And then there'll be flags out of both countries and all of that. That's what's concerning Japan and South Korea, because they think that Donald Trump could easily shoot from the hip and commit the United States to a disastrous agreement simply on the power of being flattered by Kim Jong-un. So I hope I answered your question. I rambled a little bit on that, but it is let me just say this. When it comes to Asia, when you really look at American wars or sudden attacks, 9/11, the Afghanistan, Vietnam, and Pearl Harbor, essentially all were in Asia while most Americans were not watching. So what I would like to really encourage people is, it may be far away, you may not know it, but consider the fact they have the ability now to hit the West Coast, the middle of the U.S., probably the East Coast, and they're very serious, and we really should be much more engaged in understanding them and fortifying our own defenses and being knowledgeable Americans.
Wow. So have you personally gotten any love letters from Kim Jong-un?
Checked the box this morning, and nothing came in yet. So we're still waiting. We're still waiting. But I'm glad that you asked that question, because I have a present for you I'm going to show you. Not right now, but I'm going to commit to this present. I wanted to write an article theorizing what it might be like for Kim Jong-un to start this flattery campaign again. Let me just backtrack and say, it's common knowledge here in Seoul, in Pyongyang, in Tokyo, in Taipei, in Beijing, anywhere, that Donald Trump was completely flipped by Kim Jong-un with nothing essentially in return to the United States or our allies, and that we're heading down that road again with him. So what I have drafted out is a draft letter from the foreign ministry by young underlings submitted to Kim Jong-un to flatter Trump and butter him up again as a kind of a joke. But I'm thinking, wait a second, I'm doing the foreign ministry's work for them. So I don't know. I think I'll release it. It's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek humor approach. But the point I'm trying to make is that Donald Trump was arrested for taking those love letters, which were some of his most prized possessions, when everybody in the real world knows it's just flattery and apple polishing, and they use the word excellency, which is common in diplomatic letters, and Trump apparently took it as some kind of, wow, he only speaks to me, which appeals to a malignant narcissist. Well, we all going along for the ride in the back of this car. So at any rate, make a long story short, stay tuned for that letter from Kim Jong-un to Donald Trump, and I'm going to provide it to you. Maybe you can deploy it in some fashion as you wish for your audience.
Wow, that we maybe have worldwide breaking news once that's released. That'll be awesome. All right, so I mentioned Russia just in passing. Just curious, are rubles or Twitter stock more valuable right now?
Wow. The ruble is now down below the level it was on February 22nd of 2022, of the invasion of, I should say the third invasion of Russia into Ukraine. It's just crashing as we speak. I don't know. I think their central bank may have stepped in the last few minutes and done something to stop it, but obviously it's a major problem for them. And there's a few fans of Russia here in Japan, I would say, too.
Well, speaking of fans of Russia, apparently, what do you think about Tulsi Gabbard and Sebastian Gorka?
I'm glad that you asked me that question, but what I'm really glad is that you told me no profanity is allowed in your broadcast. So I'm going to observe that rule, and I'm just going to say the following. Yes. It's bad news. Let's take them one at a time. Let's go with Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi Gabbard is seen by the Japanese media and by the Japanese officials here as either an witting or an unwitting asset of the Russian government. They don't tend to say which one of it is, but her behavior, her activity, her travel record, her pronouncements, her connections, all of those issues, her being on an FBI watch list or a travel list of some type, also have ticked them off. But what really ticked them off was that she sent out a tweet criticizing Japan for rearming, because in doing so, they were moving towards returning to imperial fascist Japan. And so here is our Director of National Intelligence designate being appointed by Donald Trump, who is telling Japan and South Korea to bear their own weight, to rearm, to build up so the U.S. can take off its burden a bit. And he's put in somebody who's saying that if Japan does that, they're going back into their fascist past. And it just has painted her completely in the Japanese media now as anti-Japanese Tulsi-san. And so she has a very bad image here. I just don't see how, if she's Director of National Intelligence and that whole situation can actually cooperate so closely with Japan and our allies out here with that type of a nominee. So that's going to be an issue. I would hope that the Senate will precisely bring up the impact of her nomination, negatively speaking, to our good allies in the region. I'm sure she's just very popular in Beijing and Pyongyang and Moscow, but I don't think that really would be a good credential for us to have. I think the second person you referred to, if I correct, Melvin, did you say Hegseth, Pete? Hegseth?
No, I said Sebastian Gorka.
Oh, well, they don't. So he's kind of an unknown quantity out here. You might Google him in Japanese. You might see some reference or whatever. So it's not really known at this point. But they have been taking close note of the Trump nominees, and there are a few that they can work with. They'll be able to work with Marco Rubio, for example. And of Trump's nominees, I would say his is the one that I'm most comfortable considering this other house of cards over here. But as it turns to Seb, no, he's not really known. But they'll be getting to know them pretty soon, I'm sure.
Okay, you mentioned Pete Hegseth. What about him?
Yeah, that would also be concerning. They're meeting with the Japanese Self-Defense Forces, the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Japanese mode, or the Minister of Defense here, whatever, with the U.S. Defense Secretary on these visits to Japan or Quad meetings or back in the United States at Camp David or the White House or whatever. the first thing the Japanese look into is the qualifications of the individual. If they're a seasoned individual, how connected they are in government, what large of an organization they have experience in running, and whatnot. And the only thing that is popping up in the Japanese press so far at this point is Pete Hegseth, commentator for Fox News. And so if you translate that into Japanese terms, it would say, I'll just make up a name, Kimura Taro, commentator for Television Asahi, becoming Minister of Defense. It's ludicrous. And so they're saying, well, what is the reasoning? What is the philosophy behind these appointments? Are they simply political favors? Are they to crash the system? Because obviously, again, Japanese are very polite. They're very diplomatic. They have to be very neutral during this period of time. They have to be very careful what they say and do, not to upset Trump. So they're going to be just going to D.C. with delegations now and trying to meet these nominees, I would imagine, under the surface one by one. But if you get their real feeling, they're going to be thinking something is wrong, something is off compared with the quality of Jim Mattis or John Bolton or like him or love him or leave him or whatever. These other ones are much higher quality and higher level. And these new crew coming in, I think, is concerning for Japan.
Wow. So you worked with former President Ronald Reagan. And
yes,
I was eligible to vote for the first time in 1984, and I cast my first ballot for Mr. Reagan. So how do you think he would view the 2024 state of the Republican Party?
I think he would recognize some of it. I believe he would reject, and he would be just, quite frankly, to be really honest, I think he would be amazed, if not disgusted, by some of the approaches on trade, on just the divisiveness of down talking the U.S. and bad mouthing the U.S. and negativity and whatever. I think when I worked for him, I was just a young paper pusher. He had a radio show between his run in 76 and his run in 80. He started a nationally syndicated radio show, and he liked to talk stories about the average people. So I worked with Lynn Nofziger, that was my boss, and Babe Buchanan, who is Pat Buchanan's sister, and she was also in that team. And I just sat and clipped articles and sent them to those two, and they sent them up to Governor Reagan's house in Santa Monica. And then once in a while, some of the articles I clipped would go out on the radio show. He had a wonderfully warm, personable, down-to-earth connection with the American people of a positive message. And I think that probably motivated you in your first vote for him. It motivated me in working for him. He would walk through once in a while and treat all of us as equals. And here he was, the future president of the United States. Just a very unassuming man who was in it for the good of the country. And personally, I think that the Donald Trump would be an antithesis of that in so many levels. And the policies of the Republican Party has come. It's almost the horseshoe theory, where you have the extreme left isolationist, anti-American over here, and you go so far to the right with the QAnon and the crazy conspiracy people and and it intersects. And Reagan would have been on the right, no doubt about it, opposing people like Carter, let's say Obama if he were on later, over here. But nevertheless, it was a healthy and competition of cooperation where he could with Tip O'Neill, for example. And I'm always fond of relating one story I remember that occurred in 1982 in October at the East Room of the White House. About 30 Republican candidates who were first-time candidates to make it to the general election were invited to the East Room for a coffee and a meet and greet with the president. And he was in there, and he was giving a greeting. And in California, two fringe equivalent of today's QAnon MAGA candidates somehow gained the party's nomination in rather strong Democratic districts, so-called sacrificial lambs. They probably would only garner 10 or 15% of the vote in the general. But they, too, were official nominees, so they were allowed to go to this meeting in the White House. So the president was up and talking and greeting them, and the two of them got up and started shouting about the New World Order and the Rockefellers and the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. And he told them to stop, and they kept it up. And he told them to stop again. And there's a famous quote, and it's on, and he just said, "Oh, shut up." And they did, and they were taken out. And I thought, okay, so we can all argue as Republicans or former Republicans, whatever our background is, of what would Reagan think about today's Republican Party. But I think that is the single most indicative approach of his that shows me where he would be with some of the people that have actually taken over the party and now the mainstream, whereas now a lot of the mainstream are on the fringes or even out, and now independents or very nominal Republicans.
So, what started your interest in Japanese culture and business?
Well, I'm from Southern California, from Los Angeles, so we already had a very large Japanese influence in Southern California, in the Gardena area and Little Tokyo, whatever. So I became interested in the culture just from the initial exposure at that time. And then I went on to work for a Republican member of Congress in the late 70s, 1980s. And he had a committee assignment that was Asian Affairs, Subcommittee of Asian Affairs in the House. And I spent 1 year on Capitol Hill working on that assignment for him, in addition to air traffic safety control, a couple of other things. But I focused a lot on the Asian refugee crisis. At that time, if you remember, communism had taken over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The dominoes fell. There was a massive outflow of refugees and a major crisis. And the congressman wanted somebody to go get some reporting on that for him. And I actually went out twice to Southeast Asia, to many of the refugee camps, and spent time in the camps and wrote reports and came back to him and helped him on his committee assignment. And from that point on, I was interested in Asia at large. And then on the way back, I stopped in Japan just for about a day or two, and I was amazed at the technology, the politeness, the order, the cleanliness. So many aspects of the society just thrilled me to see that. And I thought, well, sometime I'd like to come back here as maybe a grad student or a researcher for a little while. And I did get a Rotary International Fellowship for 2 years to come back to Japan and actually study language and business and culture. And the interest in Asia and the bug bit me, and the 2 years has now been extended to year 32.
Wow. So how do you enjoy living there?
I like it. It's very cosmopolitan. It isn't just Japan that you can experience, because you have, for example, food here from all over the world, restaurants, top-class restaurants from every nation imaginable. You have so many foreigners visiting Tokyo now from different countries. It's a very popular destination. And the people are very polite. It's a very low-crime city. You can generally go anywhere at night without any kind of fear. Let me just imagine this for one moment. In a population of 130 million, compared to the U.S., which I guess is now up to about 320 million, maybe I'm off on that.
I think it's actually a little higher than that now.
Adjusting it for the size of the populations, the crime statistics for Japan the year before last showed a total of 7 gun-related shootings. That means in the whole country, 7 guns were discharged, and of that, 5 people were killed. So 5 compared to the U.S., which is probably 200 to 300 people killed a day. I'm for Second Amendment. I have a conservative Republican background. I've lived in Japan now, and I've seen, though, that you can't carry things to extremes. And so you may get me going on another topic here, but one of the things that I really like, that many of us really like, is the safety. And you'll see little kids, 7, 8, 9 years of age, off to school by themselves in their school uniforms. Taking the bus by themselves, taking the subway by themselves, whatever. It may not always be that way. A lot of things are happening in every nation around the world in terms of crime, and it's happening here as well. But nevertheless, I really enjoy that aspect of the cleanliness and the timeliness and the orderliness. It's a great place to be.
So, what is it like seeing America from the vantage point that you are right now?
You if you're here for a long time, and this may be this experience of others, you may go into like everything about Japan is great mode for a while, for a year or two, and then the honeymoon is over, and then it's like I want to get out of this place. Everything's bad, and then you come kind of to a reasonable center where you say, these are the things I like about Japan. These are the things that I really like about the U.S. These are the things I miss about the U.S. These are the things I don't miss about. So my perspective is I miss a lot of things about the United States, such as a certain uh, friendliness and an openness to talk to strangers. Let's say, for example, you're in the supermarket and someone looks at you and you look at them and they say, yeah, I had one of those, I bought one of those steaks last week. They're really good. Just got a natural interchange of talking with people in a friendly, when there's natural disasters, Americans are very good and generous and good people and open up their hearts to help people. And that's one thing, one aspect I really appreciate about that. Because in Japan, let's say in a place like Tokyo, while it's safe and it's a little bit antiseptic in terms of human relations, of no one really talks to you unless there's an official introduction and whatever. So I act like an American. I just, how you doing in Japanese, and I smile and I hold the elevator door for them and I make eye contact, and I try to be an American as much as I can in what I consider one of the good aspects of American culture. But I've also learned a lot of good things about Japanese culture in terms of precision, timeliness, dedication, accuracy, research, planning, implementation, communication, teamwork, all these aspects that you see within Japanese corporations that has its roots in the way children are raised in the elementary school system here. This is phenomenal. And I often think, gosh, if just a few of these elements culturally could take root in the U.S. And let's say, for example, take one. Children in elementary schools here will be tasked with cleaning the schools. There are no custodians. They'll all be assigned with cleaning in a bucket and a broom or whatever, and they love it. And they do that at the end of the school day for about 20 minutes together. And if we had, more group type managed activities for people in their younger ages, rather than a strong over individualism, that's something that I think would probably benefit the United States.
Wow. I can't even imagine American students doing that. I can't even fathom it. Cleaning the school at the end of the day. They don't even clean their rooms when they get home.
Well, and you grew up in Texas. I'm getting from
Yes,
your many books, yeah. And you probably were tasked with mowing a neighbor's yard or something for 20 cents or 30 cents or whatever. A lot of that is not done. I think my impression is now anymore. But there was a lot. I think back in I was growing up, that was a very common thing to be active in in that level. So maybe that's one thing we can learn from Japan, and they can learn to kind of lighten up a little bit, like Americans, to strangers on their side.
Yeah, one thing I just thought about when I was in elementary school, I don't know if it's like this now, but early elementary school, kids were given the reward of cleaning the chalkboard. Obviously, well, we don't even have chalkboards now, so that isn't relevant. But young elementary students were given the reward of cleaning the chalkboard at the end of a lesson. And then older elementary schools were given the punishment of cleaning the chalkboard after they were caught doing it. Exact same task, different perspective.
I'm glad you asked that question about not just business and politics and ICBMs, but I'm glad we're talking the real human issues between Japan and the United States. And I would say it was with great sadness and frustration when I was here during the coronavirus, because, well, we were not on a lockdown per se. There was a kind of cooperation of shops closing. There was no official closings per se. I watched what happened in the U.S. with disinformation from Moscow into our news system, and pitting people against each other and rugged individualism over a thing like a mask, and how a mask was politicized. When, I'm in a society where mask is very common when there's a bad outbreak of something. And so people immediately went to masks here. They didn't like it. Nobody loves masks in Japan. We're not mask freaks, but they knew to be considerate of other people in the society to prevent something that will help us all. And so it was about 98% mask wearing in Japan. And the mRNA vaccines finally came here, and there was a high vaccination rate. As a result, now Japan is about 5 to 6% of the U.S. corona death rate and infection rate. Can you imagine that? 5%. And I'm thinking to myself, come on, when certain states would politicize it and Fox TV would go against these common sense things on science. And that was my biggest frustration. Was I learned a lot by living in Japan and seeing how they handled pandemics, crisis, earthquakes, and things of that type. And it really made me very sad to see so many people die in the U.S. that didn't have to, because it was not communicated from top down, the common sense. Governor DeSantis went to some high school kids before he spoke and told them, take off those masks. And when the president came back from Walter Reed, he just ripped the mask off, in defiance. And from a Japanese perspective, it's like, do they realize what they're doing to themselves? And so that's one thing that really, from a cultural perspective, kind of hurt me as an American.
Wow. So that kind of leads me into my next question. I only have a couple questions left. I saw a video clip of you on YouTube when you were talking about your experience with 9/11 and how those events, the events of that day, sort of made us all Americans in a cohesive sense. So without any type of a similar calamity, catastrophe, what do you think the chances are of us regathering our American attitude as a giant community rather than clashes of political circles?
Well, it will be a very hard nut to crack, I think. We've gone so far into our separate news silos and our separate realities and our separate existence, and to bring us back together, maybe it's like warming relationships with a former adversary in a diplomatic sense, people-to-people contact. I would bet, since we're at Thanksgiving here, that 90% or more of Americans would like to have a Thanksgiving with their family there's not the 800-pound elephant in the room of politics and division. And they can maybe have some light division and get along, but still there's no friendships being broken up or people being defriended on Facebook or hanging up the phone on a relative or whatever. All the road we've gone down is very sad to say. I hate to say that it would take a major negative world event to bring us together. I would hope somehow, and I don't know, there are programs now trying to bring the American people together in the middle. I would support those programs. I don't know how to do it, but I really would hope that would be my big hope for the country.
Okay, so as a final question here, what is your final word today for America?
For America, okay, well, stay healthy, eat right, lose weight, I should speak, and develop empathy. Think of others beyond your family. Think of countries beyond your country. Think of Ukraine and the massive refugee crisis that could occur if they're handed over to Russia, which then may force the U.S. into the region. And all of these things. Take close note of what's going on outside of the United States. Learn foreign languages. Travel. Get a passport. Make some friends with people from other countries. Join a service club like Rotary. You see the banners hanging on the wall behind me, where you can have some people-to-people exchange with other countries. So those would be my kind of advice.
Okay, that's a good way of wrapping this up. We've got some very serious topics and some light ones, and that's a good sort of middle ground, optimistic viewpoint to wrap up this particular episode. So our guest today has been geopolitical expert, former American diplomat, and current Japanese resident, Tom Logan. Tom, thanks so much for rearranging your schedule and joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on today.
All right. That's it for this week's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another great storytelling journey. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.